In October 1987, a regional passenger flight descended through clear night skies and touched down at a small Tennessee airport without incident. Every one of its 31 passengers walked off the plane. The luggage was unloaded. The engines cooled in the autumn air. The cabin crew filed their reports and went home. But when the gate agent climbed the boarding stairs and knocked on the cockpit door, no one answered. She knocked again, pushed it open, and found two neatly placed headsets resting on the center console, a completed flight log sitting open on the dash, and two empty seats. Captain Marcus Holt and First Officer Danny Reeves had simply vanished from inside a locked aircraft. No broken windows, no forced doors, no blood, no note. 35 years later, a journalist reopened the file and found something far more disturbing than an unsolved disappearance. She found evidence that someone had worked very hard to make sure it stayed unsolved. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe. New investigations every week. The last photograph ever taken of Captain Marcus Holt shows him standing beside a fuel truck at Nashville International Airport approximately 6 hours before his disappearance. He is wearing his uniform jacket open at the collar, holding a paper coffee cup, and squinting against the afternoon sun. He is smiling at whoever is behind the camera. His first officer, 29-year-old Danny Reeves, stands just behind him and slightly to the left, half turned away, as if his attention has been caught by something beyond the frame. Nobody knows what Danny was looking at. For the families of both men, that detail became its own kind of torment over the years. The way Danny's face is angled away, his eyes directed at something the photograph cannot show. His mother, Ruth Reeves, kept an enlarged print of that image on her kitchen wall for 20 years before she finally took it down. She told a reporter in 1999 that she took it down not because she had stopped grieving, but because she had started to feel that whatever Danny was looking at in that photograph had something to do with what happened later that night. She could not explain the feeling. She said it kept her awake. Marcus Holt was 44 years old. He had been flying commercially for 19 years. His colleagues described him as methodical, calm under pressure, and utterly without vanity. The kind of pilot who checked his instruments twice and triple-checked them during weather events. His wife, Elaine, would later tell investigators that he had never once failed to call home after landing. In nearly 2 decades of flying, through mechanical delays and weather holds, and once a forced landing in a Georgia cornfield, Marcus Holt had always found a telephone within 30 minutes of touching down. On the night of October 14, 1987, the telephone in the Holt kitchen never rang. Danny Reeves had been flying commercially for 4 years. He had requested the Harwick regional route specifically because it kept him close to his mother's home in eastern Tennessee. He was, by all accounts, a young man still in the early glow of a career he loved. He talked about aircraft the way other young men talked about cars, with an enthusiasm that his colleagues found either charming or exhausting depending on the day. His logbook, recovered from the cockpit, along with everything else he had left behind, showed 312 hours on this particular aircraft type. His most recent entry was timed, signed, and completely routine. Regional Air Flight 404 departed Nashville at 7:42 p.m. on October 14, 1987, bound for Harwick Regional Airport in Caldwell County, Tennessee. The flight carried 31 passengers and a crew of 4, Captain Holt, First Officer Reeves, and 2 cabin attendants, Beverly Marsh and Connie Draper. The aircraft was a twin turboprop commuter plane, small and reliable and familiar to the route. Flight time was approximately 51 minutes. At 8:34 p.m., the aircraft landed on runway 09 at Harwick Regional. Ground radar confirmed a normal approach. The tower logged the landing without incident. Passengers described a smooth flight, unremarkable in every way. Beverly Marsh and Connie Draper oversaw the deplaning, collected items left in the overhead bins, and secured the cabin. At no point during this process did either woman enter the cockpit. That was not unusual. The cockpit door remained closed throughout the deplaning procedure, as it typically did, while the flight crew completed their post-landing checklist. The gate agent, a 22-year-old woman named Penny Albright, climbed the boarding stairs at approximately 8:51 p.m. to collect the flight documents from the captain. She knocked. She waited. She knocked again. When the door opened inward at her push, she stood in the entrance for a moment without comprehending what she was seeing, or rather, what she was not seeing. The seats were empty, both of them. The headsets were placed with deliberate neatness on the center console. The flight log was open and completed in Marcus Holt's handwriting, the final entry timed at 8:35 p.m., 1 minute after touchdown. The cockpit windows were intact. The emergency exit behind the co-pilot's seat was sealed from the inside, its red handle in the locked position. The door through which Penny Albright had just entered was the only way in or out of the cockpit. Penny stood there for 11 seconds before she started screaming. She would later say, in an interview she gave only once and never repeated, that the thing that frightened her most was not the emptiness itself. It was the headsets, the way they had been placed so carefully, side by side, as if both men had taken them off slowly and deliberately, set them down with consideration, and then stepped out of the world. The investigation that followed would last 18 months officially, and in some form or another has never truly ended. No remains were ever found. No suspects were ever named. No motive was ever established to the public's satisfaction. The case file was transferred twice between agencies and eventually archived in a regional federal storage facility outside Knoxville, where it sat for over 3 decades in a box marked simply, Holt, Reeves, pending. In the spring of 2022, a journalist named Nora Vance submitted a Freedom of Information request for that file. What she found inside changed everything she thought she understood about what had happened on the night of October 14, 1987. And it put her in a kind of danger she had not anticipated and was not, by any measure, prepared for. Nora Vance was not, by her own admission, a natural optimist. She had been working in investigative journalism for 11 years, long enough to have developed a professional suspicion of clean endings and a deep respect for the ones that refused to come. She was 38, precise in her habits, and possessed of a particular quality that her editor at the Harlan Review called productive obsession, and her ex-husband had called something considerably less flattering. She kept her notes in color-coded binders. She returned phone calls within the hour. She did not let things go. The Holt-Reeves file had come to her attention through an unlikely chain of events. A retired air traffic controller named Felix Strand had sent a letter, handwritten, to the Review's general mailbox in February of 2022. The letter was 4 pages long, written in a cramped, careful hand on lined notebook paper, and it described something Felix had heard over the radio during the final approach of Flight 404, something he had reported at the time and been told, firmly and without elaboration, to exclude from his official statement. Felix Strand was 71 years old. He had a heart condition and a grandchild on the way. He wrote that he was not afraid of dying, but that he was afraid of dying with what he knew still locked inside him. Nora drove to his home in Morristown on a Tuesday morning in late March, when the dogwoods along the interstate were just beginning to open and the air still carried the cold edge of a retreating winter. Felix lived in a modest brick ranch house on a quiet street, and he met her at the door wearing a flannel shirt and the expression of a man who has spent 35 years rehearsing a conversation and is not entirely sure he wants to have it. They sat at his kitchen table. He made coffee. He placed the original copy of his unsubmitted statement on the table between them, still in the envelope he had carried it home in on the night of October 14, 1987, and had never opened since. What Felix told her over the next 2 hours fundamentally altered the shape of the case in Nora's mind. At 8:31 p.m., approximately 3 minutes before touchdown, Felix had received a transmission from the cockpit of Flight 404. It was not on the standard ATC frequency. It came through on a secondary channel that the tower monitored but rarely used, a channel sometimes employed for pilot-to-ground crew coordination at smaller regional airports. The transmission lasted approximately 8 seconds. Felix had written down the words immediately after, exactly as he heard them, on a scrap of paper he still had, preserved inside the same envelope. The words were, "They're on the plane. Do not let them off until we are clear." The voice was male, controlled, not panicked, but carrying the particular flatness of a person suppressing fear. Felix believed then and now that it was Captain Holt's voice. He had spoken with Marcus Holt on standard frequency 3 times during the flight and felt confident in the identification. The transmission was never followed up. No further communication came from the cockpit before landing. When Felix reported what he had heard to his supervisor that same night, after the disappearance had been discovered, he was taken into a small office and questioned for 40 minutes by 2 men he had never seen before, and whose identification, when briefly shown to him, indicated federal affiliation but no specific agency. They told him that the transmission was likely a miscommunication from another aircraft, possibly a private charter operating in the area. They told him that including it in his official statement would create unnecessary confusion in the investigation. They were polite. They were very calm. Felix said that the calmness, more than anything, was what frightened him. He signed a statement that did not mention the transmission. He went home. He did not sleep. He never spoke about it to anyone until he wrote that letter to the Harlan Review 35 years later. Nora drove back to her apartment in Knoxville that evening with Felix's statement photocopied in her bag and her mind running at the kind of speed that made eating and sleeping feel like interruptions. She sat at her desk until 2 in the morning, building a timeline, and it was somewhere around midnight that she noticed the first anomaly in the official passenger manifest, the one buried in the FOIA documents she had received 3 weeks earlier and only partially reviewed. 31 passengers were listed on the manifest. 31 passengers were recorded as having deplaned. But the original booking records, attached to the file as a secondary document and apparently overlooked during the initial investigation's archiving, showed only 30 names. A 31st passenger had been added to the manifest by hand, in ink, at some point between the departure gate in Nashville and the landing in Harwick. The name written in the margin was R. Calloway. No address, no contact information, no seat assignment, no record of a ticket purchase. Nora stared at that name for a long time. Then she opened a new binder, wrote Flight 404 on the tab in red marker, and began again from the beginning. The Harwick Regional Airport no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The terminal building, a single-story structure of pale brick and aluminum framing that had never been more than functionally adequate, had been converted into a storage facility for a landscaping company sometime in the early 2000s. The runway was still intact, cracked now and threaded through with weeds at the edges, maintained at a minimal level by the county for occasional private aircraft use. The control tower stood empty, its windows dark, a rusted padlock on the door at its base. Nora arrived on a Friday morning in early April, 2 weeks after her conversation with Felix Strand. She parked on the crumbling apron near the old terminal and sat in her car for a moment, looking at the building. It was a gray morning, low clouds moving fast overhead, and the wind off the surrounding hills carried the smell of rain. The landscaping company's equipment was visible through the old terminal windows: mowers, blowers, coiled hoses hanging on hooks where the departures board had once been mounted. She had come for 2 reasons. The first was to meet Harwick County Sheriff Arlen Pruitt, who had been a young deputy on the night of the disappearance and was now, at 63, 4 months from retirement. He had agreed to speak with her after 2 weeks of declined phone calls, agreeing finally in a text message that contained no salutation and only 5 words. Fine. Friday, 10 o'clock. Bring coffee. She had brought coffee. He arrived at 10:07 in a personal truck rather than a department vehicle, which she noted and found interesting. He was a large man running to heaviness now, with a gray mustache and the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades watching people decide whether to tell the truth. He took the coffee without comment and leaned against the hood of her car, looking at the old terminal. Arlen Pruitt remembered the night clearly. He said that was the problem, that he had never stopped remembering it clearly, and that clarity had not brought him any comfort over the years. He had been 28 years old, 3 years into the job, and the call had come in just after 9. He had arrived at the airport within 15 minutes to find the gate agent, Penny Albright, sitting on the boarding stairs with a colleague's jacket around her shoulders, unable to stop shaking. The 2 cabin attendants were inside the terminal being interviewed by his senior deputy. The aircraft sat on the apron with its door open and its interior lights on, looking perfectly ordinary and somehow deeply wrong in the way that ordinary things become wrong when they contain an impossibility. Arlen had gone up the stairs himself. He had stood in that cockpit doorway for what felt like a very long time. He described it much as Penny Albright had, the neatness, the deliberateness of those placed headsets. But he added a detail that had never appeared in any report Nora had read. On the floor beside the captain's seat, partially tucked beneath the seat rail, there was a single playing card. The 7 of clubs, face up. He had photographed it, bagged it, and submitted it as evidence. By the time the federal investigators arrived the following morning and took custody of the evidence collection, the card was no longer in the bag. The bag was sealed, and its contents log showed nothing had been removed. But the card was gone. Nora wrote that down carefully. She asked him what he thought it meant. He was quiet for a moment, working the lid of his coffee cup with his thumb. He said he didn't know what it meant, but that in 35 years of law enforcement, he had learned that when evidence disappears from a sealed bag, it means someone with access and authority removed it, which means someone with access and authority had a reason to remove it. And those 2 facts together meant that whatever the card represented had been important enough to protect. He said he had thought about that card for 35 years. He said some nights he thought the card was nothing, a coincidence, a piece of trash on the floor. Other nights he was sure it was a signal, left deliberately, a message from one of the pilots to whoever found that cockpit, directed at someone who would understand what it meant. She asked him who might have understood it. He looked at her for a moment with those careful eyes and said he had spent 3 decades not asking that question out loud, and he was not about to start now, 4 months before he drew his pension. But he said it without heat. He said it the way a person says something they have rehearsed as a refusal but no longer entirely believe in. Before they parted, Nora asked him about the name R. Calloway on the manifest. Arlen set his coffee cup on the hood of her car. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He said he remembered the name, said it had been flagged briefly during the initial investigation, and then quietly unflagged. Said that when he had asked his supervisor at the time why it had been dropped as a line of inquiry, he was told that Calloway had been identified and cleared, and that the matter was closed. He had never been told who identified Calloway. He had never been shown documentation of the clearance. He had not pushed, because the men who told him it was closed were the same calm men with the unspecified federal identification, and the look in their eyes when they said it was closed communicated something that did not require elaboration. Nora drove back toward Knoxville through the beginning of the forecasted rain, the windshield wipers keeping time against the gray afternoon. By the time she reached the interstate, she had decided that finding R. Calloway, whatever that took, was the center of everything. The 2 pilots had seen something, or known something, or carried something on that plane that night. The cockpit had been emptied not by accident or by chance, but by intention, by planning, and someone with significant reach had spent 35 years making sure that the question of why stayed buried in a box marked pending. The rain thickened as she drove. Somewhere behind her, in the field beyond the crumbling runway at Harwick Regional, a pair of crows had landed in the wet grass and were working at something in the dirt with their beaks, unconcerned and methodical, the way scavengers always are when they know exactly what they have found. The archive was in a federal storage facility 20 miles outside Knoxville, a low concrete building behind a chain-link fence that was neither impressive nor particularly secure-looking, which Nora suspected was itself a kind of design choice. Things that looked unimportant were less likely to attract attention. She had spent 3 weeks navigating the paperwork required to access the physical file beyond what the FOIA had released, and she had done it by finding a sympathetic archivist named Doreen Falk, a woman in her late 50s who had worked in federal records management for 26 years and had developed, over those decades, a quiet contempt for selective transparency. Doreen met her at the facility entrance on a Wednesday morning in late April, carrying a visitor badge and an expression of mild professional neutrality that Nora had learned to read as cautious goodwill. They walked together through a climate-controlled corridor that smelled of old paper and cleaning solvent, past rows of industrial shelving stacked floor to ceiling with labeled boxes. The silence in the building was the particular silence of contained information, dense and pressurized. The Holt Reeves box was on a middle shelf in section 14. Doreen placed it on a reading table and left Nora alone with it, as they had agreed, for 2 hours. Nora pulled on her archive gloves and opened the box with the particular reverence she always felt when touching the physical residue of something that had destroyed lives. The file was organized into 4 labeled folders. She worked through the first 2 methodically, cross-referencing against her own notes, and found nothing she had not already seen in the foyer release. Witness statements, ground crew reports, passenger interviews, meteorological data, technical assessments of the aircraft. Everything clean, coherent, and curiously uninformative. The third folder contained aircraft maintenance records and was similarly unrevealing. She was beginning to feel the particular deflation of an archive visit that confirms only what you already know when she opened the 4th folder and found, beneath a stack of duplicated boarding documents, a sealed brown envelope that bore no label, no date, and no filing reference number. It had not appeared in the FOIA index, which meant either it had been missed during digitization or it had been deliberately omitted. Her hands were very still as she opened it. Inside were 3 items. The first was a photograph, black and white, printed on the glossy paper common to the era. It showed the interior of a small room she did not recognize. Bare walls, a single table, 2 chairs facing each other. Seated in one chair was a man in civilian clothing whose face was partially turned from the camera. He was broad-shouldered, somewhere in his 40s, and wore a sport coat over an open-collar shirt. Seated across from him was a man in a pilot's uniform. Nora studied the second man's face for a long time before the recognition arrived, slow and cold as groundwater. It was Marcus Holt. The photograph was dated in pencil on the reverse, October 9th, 1987, 5 days before the flight. The second item was a single typed page, dense with text, with the top 2 inches torn away, removing whatever header or classification marking had been there. What remained was the lower portion of what appeared to be an operational briefing of some kind, the language bureaucratic and carefully drained of specific meaning in the way that documents written to be deniable always are. Phrases surfaced as she read, asset cooperative but expressing instability. Transfer window confirmed for 14th October. Secondary package to be held at Harwick pending ground confirmation. Contingency protocol if primary fails. The page was unsigned. The bottom right corner bore a faint stamp, partially legible, Div 7. She did not know what Div 7 meant. She wrote it down. The third item was a handwritten note on a piece of paper torn from a spiral notebook. The handwriting was different from the document, smaller and more urgent looking. The letters pressed hard into the page. It read, M knows, D doesn't. Keep them separated at Harwick. Callaway handles the rest. Nora sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of the archive room for a long moment. The ventilation system hummed steadily above her. She thought about Marcus Holt standing beside that fuel truck 6 hours before his flight, squinting into the afternoon sun, smiling at the camera. She thought about Danny Reeves half turned away in the background, looking at something beyond the frame. She thought about the transmission Felix Strand had kept locked in an envelope for 35 years. They're on the plane. Do not let them off until we are clear. M knows. D doesn't. Marcus knew. Danny didn't. And Callaway, whoever Callaway was, had been positioned at Harwick to handle whatever came next. Both pilots had vanished from a locked cockpit, but perhaps they had not vanished the same way, or for the same reason, or at the hands of the same people. Perhaps only one of them had been the intended target. Perhaps the other had simply been standing too close to a thing he was never supposed to see. She photographed all 3 items with her phone before returning them to the envelope exactly as she had found them. When Doreen returned at the end of the 2 hours, Nora thanked her with genuine warmth and said the visit had been useful. Doreen looked at her with the particular perception of a woman who has watched many researchers leave this building and can tell the difference between those who found nothing and those who found something they wish they hadn't. On the drive back to Knoxville, Nora stopped at a gas station and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before she trusted herself to drive. Her hands were steady. Her mind was not. She called her editor, a measured man named Graham Sells, who had been in the business long enough to remain calm at most things. She told him what she had found. There was a silence on his end that lasted several seconds, which from Graham was the equivalent of someone else dropping the phone. Then he said, "Nora, you need to be very careful about who you tell about this." She asked him what he meant. He said he would explain when she came in. He said to come in tomorrow. He said to bring printed copies of everything, not digital, printed, and to keep them somewhere other than her apartment. She asked him why. He said one word before he hung up. Calloway.
Graham Sells had been editing investigative journalism for 23 years and had developed the kind of operational paranoia that, in another profession, might have warranted concern. But in his was simply good practice. When Nora arrived at the review offices on Thursday morning with 2 printed envelopes tucked inside a book in her bag, Graham was already waiting in the small conference room with the blinds drawn and a look on his face that she had seen only twice before in their 6 years of working together. Once when a source had been threatened, and once when a story had attracted the wrong kind of attention from the wrong kind of people. He told her to sit down. Then he told her what he knew about Calloway. 3 weeks earlier, before Nora's archive visit, Graham had received a phone call from a man who introduced himself only as a former employee of a federal contracting agency who had seen the review's FOIA filing listed in a public records index. The man had not given his name. He had spoken for approximately 4 minutes. He said that the name Calloway appearing in connection with Flight 404 was not an anomaly. It was a thread that, if pulled, connected to something considerably larger and considerably more dangerous than the disappearance of 2 pilots. He said the review should understand what it was walking into before it walked further. Then he had hung up and had not called back. Graham had said nothing to Nora at the time because he had not wanted to shape her research with external suggestion. He wanted her findings to be her own. But what she had found in the archive had confirmed enough of what the caller implied that he no longer felt he could stay quiet. Nora laid out her photographs on the conference table. The picture of Marcus Holt in that bare room, 5 days before the flight. The torn briefing page with its phrases about transfer windows and contingency protocols. The handwritten note. Graham studied them in silence, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, leaning close. He said, "Div 7 is a designation I've heard before, once from a source I had in 1994, working a completely different story about a cluster of mid-level federal contractors who were quietly dissolved between 1988 and 1991. The source used that term once and would not elaborate." Nora asked him what he thought it was. He said he thought it was an internal division designation for an off-book operational unit. The kind of structure that exists in the space between acknowledged agencies, funded through contracting mechanisms specifically because contracting mechanisms are harder to trace than direct appropriations. He said he could not prove that. He said she should treat it as a working hypothesis and nothing more. They spent the morning building the emerging picture together. What the evidence suggested, taken collectively, was this. Marcus Holt had been recruited, or coerced, or both, into participating in some kind of operation connected to DIV-7 in the days before the flight. The meeting photographed on October 9th was likely the point of contact. The operation involved a transfer of something or someone described in the briefing document as a secondary package to be held at Harwick pending confirmation. Calloway had been the operational handler at the receiving end. The handwritten note suggested that Denny Reeves had been kept uninformed, that his presence in the cockpit that night was incidental to whatever had been planned. A working colleague who happened to be in the wrong seat at the wrong moment. What had happened to both men afterward was the question that the evidence did not yet answer, but the architecture of the disappearance was beginning to make a different kind of sense. The neatness of the cockpit, the placed headsets, the completed flight log. These were not the marks of a panicked abduction. They were the marks of a controlled extraction. Someone had been waiting for that plane to land, someone who knew exactly which door to come through and exactly how much time they had between touchdown and the gate agent's arrival. That afternoon, Nora drove to East Tennessee to speak with Ruth Reeves, Danny's mother. She was 81 years old now, living in a small assisted living facility in a town called Granger Hollow, 40 minutes east of Knoxville. She was sharp and unhesitating in her recollections, and carried her grief the way very old people sometimes carry long grief. Not as a wound anymore, but as a permanent characteristic, the way a tree grows around a scar in its bark. Ruth told Nora that in the weeks before the flight, Danny had seemed distracted. Not troubled exactly, but inward. She had attributed it at the time to normal work fatigue and had not pressed him. But 2 days before the flight, he'd called her in the evening and said something she had thought about every day for 35 years. He had said, "Mom, if you ever meet a man who says he's a friend of Captain Holt's and that Marcus sent him, don't believe him. Don't let him in the house." Ruth had laughed at the time. She had asked Danny what on earth he was talking about. He had said it was nothing, just a feeling he had, and changed the subject. It was the last conversation she ever had with him. He had not wanted to alarm her. Nora understood that. He had known enough to issue a warning, and not enough, or not in time, to understand the full shape of what he was warning against. He had been flying towards something that night without knowing what it was, and the only protection he had been able to offer the person he loved most was a quiet, half-explained caution issued over the telephone 2 days before everything ended. Nora sat in the parking lot of the facility for a long time after the visit. The hills around Granger Hollow were deep green in the late afternoon light, the kind of green that only East Tennessee produces in spring, layered and saturated and indifferent to human sorrow. She thought about a 29-year-old man in a cockpit at night, beginning to understand something he could not yet name. She thought about the moment that understanding must have completed itself, somewhere in those final minutes before landing, when it was already too late. She started the car. She had one more call to make before dark. She needed to find someone who knew what had been transferred at Harwick Regional Airport on the night of October 14th, 1987. And she thought, with a cold and focused certainty that had nothing to do with optimism, that she was beginning to understand where to look. The call she needed to make was to a man named Walter Price, and making it required a kind of nerve she had to locate carefully and hold on to. Walter Price was 77 years old and lived in a house outside Maryville that he had not voluntarily left in 4 years. He had been, between 1979 and 1991, a senior logistics coordinator for a private federal contracting firm called Meridian Operational Services. Meridian had been dissolved in 1991 under circumstances that were officially described as a routine corporate restructuring and were, based on the paper trail Nora had spent 2 evenings following, nothing of the kind. She had found Walter's name in a 1993 lawsuit filing, one of 4 former Meridian employees who had attempted a wrongful termination claim that was settled out of court with a non-disclosure agreement whose terms had apparently never been tested. She had his phone number through a contact at the county assessor's office. She called from her car, still parked outside Ruth Reeves's facility, with the green hills going golden in the fading light. Walter answered on the 4th ring. His voice was careful from the first syllable, the voice of a man who had been waiting for a call he did not want and had made peace, provisionally, with the idea of receiving it. She told him who she was. She told him what she was investigating. She waited. The silence on his end lasted long enough that she checked her phone screen to confirm the call was still connected. Then he said, "How did you find Meridian?" And in the way he asked it, she understood that finding Meridian was the threshold, that everything before it was preamble, and everything after it was a different kind of conversation. She drove to Maryville the following morning, Saturday, through a fog that had settled into the valleys overnight and showed no inclination to lift. Walter's house was a modest two-story set back from the road behind old oak trees that were still bare enough in early May to look skeletal in the mist. He met her at the door in a cardigan and slippers, looking smaller than she had imagined from his voice, with the careful stillness of a man who had organized his life around minimizing exposure. He made tea. He did not offer to show her the house, and she did not ask. They sat in a front room that was clean and almost aggressively ordinary, the kind of room assembled to communicate normalcy. The only anomaly was the window, which had a secondary lock fitted to the frame above the standard latch, and beside it a small convex mirror angled to show the driveway approach without requiring anyone to stand near the glass. Walter had been with Meridian for 12 years. He said that for the first 8 of those years he had believed it was a legitimate contractor providing logistical support to federal agencies for domestic operational needs, transportation, secure site management, personnel coordination. In his 9th year, he had been assigned to a project designated internally as Corridor 7, and it was in the course of that assignment that he had understood, incrementally and then all at once, what Meridian actually was, and what it had been doing since long before his arrival. He would not name the federal agency that had contracted Meridian. He said he was not being evasive, he simply did not know with certainty, and the distinction mattered to him. What he knew was the operational structure. Div 7 was not a Meridian designation. It was a designation used by whoever contracted Meridian, a client-side classification for a specific category of operation. The operations it covered involved the movement of individuals who were, in the language of the briefing documents Walter had processed, liabilities requiring controlled transition. He paused when he said that phrase. He looked at his tea. He said, "That is a phrase that means different things depending on who is being moved and why. Sometimes it meant protective custody, sometimes it meant something else entirely." Nora asked him about Flight 404 directly. She placed the photograph of Marcus Holt on the table between them and watched Walter's face. Something passed across it that was not quite recognition and not quite surprise. He looked at the photograph for a long time without touching it. He said he had not personally coordinated that operation, but he had seen the Harwick Regional Site listed in a Corridor 7 routing document in late September 1987, approximately 2 weeks before the flight. The site was designated as a secondary transfer point. He said that secondary transfer points were used when the primary extraction method carried a risk of exposure, when a more public venue, an airport with normal security and staffing, needed to be used for part of the operation, but the actual transfer needed to happen at a location where oversight was minimal and personnel could be controlled. She asked him what was being transferred at Harwick that night. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the fog had begun to thin slightly, the oak trees becoming more defined against the pale sky. A car passed slowly on the road beyond the driveway, and Walter's eyes went to the convex mirror involuntarily, tracking it until it was gone. He said he believed a person was being transferred, a person who had been providing information to someone, or multiple someones, whose identities and activities were sensitive enough to require the kind of operation that used a regional commuter flight as its vehicle. He said the pilots had been selected because the route was short, the airport was small, and the landing time fell within a window when the facility would have minimum staffing. He said Marcus Holt's involvement, based on the photograph Nora had shown him, suggested recruitment rather than abduction, that Holt had been approached and had agreed, willingly or under sufficient pressure to function as willingness, to carry the operation's requirements. She asked what had gone wrong. Walter set down his teacup. He said he did not know for certain what had gone wrong, but he said that secondary packages, in the vocabulary of Corridor 7, sometimes arrived with complications that the primary planners had not anticipated. He said that on 2 previous Corridor 7 operations he had processed, a secondary package had arrived in a condition or with an accompaniment that changed the calculus of the extraction entirely. He would not specify what he meant by condition or accompaniment. He said that whatever had complicated the Harwick operation had been significant enough to escalate it, and that escalated Corridor 7 operations followed a protocol he had seen referenced in documents, but had never wanted to know the specific content of. He said the protocol was called lamplight.
Nora wrote the word down.
She looked at it. She asked him if lamplight was what had happened to Marcus Holt and Danny Reeves. Walter looked at the convex mirror again. Then he looked at her with the eyes of a man who has lived 30 years with the specific weight of knowing something he cannot prove and cannot forget. He said, "I think Danny Reeves was never supposed to be part of any of it. I think he saw something on that plane during the descent that he was never meant to see. And I think Marcus Holt, whatever his arrangement was, had not been told what lamplight would mean for the people around him." She drove back to Knoxville through the lifting fog, with the word written in her notebook and the cold, spreading feeling that she had just crossed a line she would not be able to uncross. That evening, she found a new note under her apartment door. Plain white envelope, no stamp, hand delivered. Inside was a single index card. On it, printed in block letters, "You have gone far enough. This is courtesy. The next one is not." She photographed it. She called Graham. She did not sleep. She moved out of her apartment the following morning. It was not a panicked decision. It was a procedural one, made with the same methodical attention she brought to her color-coded binders and her hourly phone returns. Panic was a luxury she could not currently afford. She packed a single bag with clothes and her most essential printed materials, transferred the critical documents to a second location she trusted, and booked a room at a mid-range hotel on the western edge of Knoxville under the name of her college roommate, who had long since moved to Oregon, and whose identity Nora was reasonably certain no one monitoring her movements would think to check. Graham had wanted her to stop. Not permanently, not in so many words, but she could hear it beneath everything he said when she called him that morning. The careful editorial calculation of a man weighing a story's value against the possibility of something happening to the person writing it. She told him she was not stopping. She told him she was being careful. She told him the note under the door meant she was close enough to something that someone had decided a warning was cheaper than the alternative, and that warnings of that kind were, in her experience, issued precisely when the thing being protected was most vulnerable to exposure. He said, "Nora, please understand what I'm telling you." She said she did. She hung up and checked the locks on her hotel room door. She spent the morning working the name Lamplight through every database and archive access she had accumulated over 11 years of investigative work. It returned nothing in any indexed federal document. It appeared once in a 1996 academic paper on post-Cold War intelligence restructuring, cited in a footnote as an unverified designator for a domestic operational protocol of unknown scope, sourced to an anonymous former intelligence contractor. The academic who had written the paper was a professor at the University of Virginia named Dr. Carol Settles. She was still there. Nora emailed her. In the early afternoon, she drove back to Morristown to see Felix Strand again. She'd called ahead. He was waiting for her at the kitchen table with coffee already made, which she took as a sign that he had been expecting her return, or something like it, and had been sitting with his decision about how much further to go. She told him what she had found. Not all of it, not Walter Price by name, not the specific contents of the archive envelope, but enough. She told him that the transmission he had heard that night, there on the plane, appeared to have been a warning from Marcus Holt to a ground contact, that the plane was carrying something or someone connected to a classified operation, and that the operation had gone wrong in a way that resulted in both pilots vanishing under a protocol called lamplight. Felix listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt and placed a small, folded piece of paper on the table. He said, "I didn't put this in the envelope I gave you because I wanted to be sure about you first. I've had 35 years to be wrong about things. I didn't want to be wrong about one more." She unfolded it. It was a second transcript, this one handwritten in Felix's cramped, careful print, dated to the same night, timed at 8:29 p.m., 2 minutes before the first transmission. It was also on the secondary channel. It was also a male voice, but not Marcus Holt's. A different voice, lower, more deliberate. Felix had written at the bottom of the transcript, "This voice came from the ground, from inside the airport. Someone with access to the secondary channel on the ground side." The transcript read, "Holt, confirm package status. We have a problem at the gate. Calloway is not at the position. Repeat, Calloway is not at the position." Nora read it 3 times. She looked up at Felix. He nodded, reading her face. Calloway had not been there. Whatever Calloway had been assigned to do at Harwick Regional on the night of October 14th, 1987, he had not been at his position when the plane was 2 minutes from landing. And someone on the ground had known it, had been monitoring the secondary channel, and had told Marcus Holt. The implications expanded in her mind with a cold and terrible logic. If Calloway was the handler, the person designated to receive the transfer and manage what came next, and Calloway had not been there, then the operation had arrived at its endpoint without the person responsible for its completion. The secondary package, whatever or whoever it was, had been on that plane with nowhere to go. And Marcus Holt, sitting in that cockpit with a first officer who knew nothing, had been informed of the failure with approximately 2 minutes before touchdown to decide what to do about it. He had chosen to land anyway. He had sent his own transmission warning someone not to let whatever was on the plane off until it was clear. And then, in the 17 minutes between touchdown and Penny Albright's knock on the cockpit door, something had happened in or around that aircraft that had removed both men from the physical world so completely that 35 years of searching had produced nothing. She left Felix's house at 4 in the afternoon. She drove south on the interstate in the thin spring light, past the dogwoods that were now in full bloom, white and startling against the green hills. She was thinking about the 17-minute window, about what could happen in 17 minutes at a small regional airport at night with minimal staffing and a plane parked on an apron away from the main terminal. Her phone buzzed. A reply from Dr. Carol Settles at the University of Virginia, faster than she had expected. Short, formal, and at its close, a single line that changed the texture of everything. "I would strongly recommend we speak by phone rather than email. The person who originally provided me with the lamplight designation contacted me again last month. They said someone was asking questions. That was before your email arrived." Nora pulled off the interstate at the next exit. She sat in a gas station parking lot with the engine running and the dogwoods visible above the roofline in the last of the afternoon light. White is something ceremonial. White is something left behind on purpose. She thought about the playing card missing from a sealed evidence bag. She thought about a 29-year-old pilot half-turned in a photograph, looking at something nobody else could see. She called Dr. Settles. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She left a message. She waited. The light changed. The dogwoods held their color against the darkening sky with a stubbornness that felt, in her current state of mind, like a statement about things that refused to disappear entirely, no matter how thoroughly someone tried to make them. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, older, and precise in its enunciation in the way of someone who had spent a career choosing words for their operational accuracy rather than their warmth. He said, "Ms. Vance, my name is not important right now. What is important is that you understand something before you take another step. Calloway was not absent from Harwick that night. Calloway was there. Calloway was the problem." The line went dead. She sat in the parking lot for a long time. Somewhere above the gas station roof, a single crow had settled on a power line and was watching the road below with the black, unreadable attention of a creature that has learned to wait. She did not sleep that night. Not from fear exactly, though fear was present and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge it. What kept her awake was the specific cognitive dissonance of a framework collapsing and rebuilding itself simultaneously. Everything she had constructed over the past 6 weeks, The recruited pilot, the uninformed co-pilot, the absent handler, the vanished package had been assembled around a central assumption that Calloway was an external actor, someone positioned at Harwick to receive and manage. The voice on the phone had dismantled that assumption in 11 words. Calloway was there. Calloway was the problem. She sat at the hotel room desk with her printed materials spread across the surface and worked through the implications methodically, the way she always worked, starting from what was certain and building outward. What was certain? Marcus Holt had been recruited into an operation. Danny Reeves had known enough to issue a private warning to his mother without knowing the full shape of what he was warning against. Someone had been on the plane designated as a secondary package. Calloway's name appeared on a handwritten addition to the passenger manifest. The ground transmission had reported Calloway absent from position. The unknown caller had said Calloway was present and was the problem. Those last two facts were not contradictory if Calloway was both the person expected at the ground position and the name on the manifest. If Calloway had been the secondary package itself, not the handler but the asset being transferred, then the ground transmission reporting his absence from position meant something different entirely. It meant that whoever was waiting to receive Calloway at Harwick had been communicating with Marcus Holt, under the assumption that Calloway would arrive as cargo, controllable and managed, and had discovered in those final minutes of descent that this was not the case. That Calloway had arrived as a passenger, aware, autonomous, possibly armed with information about what was supposed to happen to him on the ground. The operation had not failed because the handler was absent. The operation had failed because the asset had understood the operation. By 3 a.m, she had a working hypothesis that frightened her considerably more than the note under her apartment door. She wrote it out in longhand, slowly, the way she always committed to a theory that she was not yet ready to say aloud. Calloway had been targeted for a lamplight extraction, meaning a controlled and permanent removal from any situation where he could cause exposure. He had discovered this, or been warned of it, before or during the flight. Marcus Holt, either complicit in the plan against Calloway or terrified of what Calloway represented, had sent the transmission not to protect Calloway, but to warn the ground team that the asset knew. Danny Reeves had seen or heard something during the descent that completed his own fragmentary understanding of what he had been flying into. Both men had walked off that plane into a 17-minute window managed by people who could not afford witnesses. She called Dr. Carol Settles at 7 a.m. The professor answered on the second ring, which meant she had been awake and waiting. Her voice was measured and academic in its cadence, but carried beneath it a current of something that Nora recognized as sustained, well-managed anxiety. Dr. Settles had published her paper on post-Cold War intelligence restructuring in 1996. The lamplight footnote had come from a single source, a man who had contacted her through the university's general inquiry system in 1995, identified himself only as a former federal contractor, and provided her with a 3-page document outlining the general parameters of lamplight as a domestic protocol. He had asked only that she reference it academically, creating a public record, however small, of its existence. She'd verified what she could, found nothing contradictory, and included it. She had never heard from him again until last month. In April 2022, a brief message had arrived through the same university inquiry channel. It said only, "Someone is going to find the thread. When they do, tell them the package was not an asset. The package was a witness." Nora wrote that down with a hand that was not entirely steady. A witness. Not an intelligence asset being protected or extracted or neutralized for operational reasons. A witness to something specific, something that had happened and that Calloway had seen and could testify to, and whose testimony was dangerous enough to warrant lamplight. She asked Dr. Settles if she had any indication of what Calloway had witnessed. The professor said she did not. She said the 1995 document had not been specific about the content of the exposure risk, only the structure of the protocol designed to contain it. She said she had spent 27 years occasionally wondering about it and had arrived at no conclusion she trusted. Before they ended the call, Dr. Settles said something that she framed carefully, in the precise, hedged language of an academic, but that landed in Nora's mind with the weight of something long suspected, finally spoken aloud. She said that in her research into intelligence restructuring of that period, she had found a consistent pattern in the cases where lamplight-adjacent protocols had been applied. The witnesses targeted were never witnesses to foreign intelligence operations. They were witnesses to domestic ones, things that had happened on American soil to American citizens managed by American institutional actors. The entire machinery of classification and deniability and off-book contracting that structures like Div 7 and Meridian existed to maintain was not built in these cases to protect national security in the conventional sense. It was built to protect specific people from specific accountability. Nora thanked her. She sat for a moment after the call, looking at her notes. Then she opened her laptop and began searching a different direction entirely, pulling away from the operational structure and toward the human question at its center. Not what lamplight was, who Calloway had seen, what they had done, and whether any trace of it had survived in the public record, buried somewhere under 35 years of accumulated distance, waiting with the patience of things that have no choice but to wait. It took her 4 hours. It was not in any federal record or intelligence archive. It was in a newspaper. A small regional paper from Caldwell County, Tennessee, the same county as Harwick Regional Airport. An article dated September 3, 1987, 6 weeks before the flight. A brief piece, local crime report level, about the discovery of a man's body in a limestone ravine 12 miles outside the town of Harwick. The body was identified as belonging to a 41-year-old accountant named Thomas Greer, who worked for a Knoxville-based financial services firm. The cause of death was listed as accidental, a fall. The case was closed within 11 days. The financial services firm Thomas Greer had worked for was called Meridian Operational Services. She stared at the screen for a long time. Thomas Greer had died 6 weeks before Flight 404. He had worked for Meridian. His death had been closed as accidental in 11 days, which was fast, and he had died 12 miles from the airport that would later be used for a classified extraction. Calloway, whatever his real name was, had witnessed something connected to Thomas Greer's death, had been scheduled for lamplight removal, had arrived on that plane not as cargo, but as a man who understood he was being taken somewhere to be disappeared, and who had decided in the 51 minutes of that flight that he would not go quietly. The 17-minute window after landing. Nora thought about it differently now. Not as a window in which 2 pilots were taken, but as a window in which something far more complex had unraveled, in which a man who knew he was being killed had made choices that the operation's architects had not planned for, and in which the pilots, one complicit and one innocent, had been caught in the machinery of those choices, with nowhere to go and no one coming to help them. She closed her laptop. She needed one more thing. She needed a name. She called Walter Price in Maryville. He answered immediately. She asked him directly, without preamble, whether the name Thomas Greer meant anything to him in the context of Corridor 7. The silence on his end was the longest yet. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something just above a whisper. He said, "Tom Greer was the one who found the accounts. He brought them to someone he trusted inside Meridian. He did not know that the person he trusted was the one who needed them buried. He was dead within 2 weeks of that conversation." She asked him who Greer had trusted. Walter said, "The man who ran Corridor 7, a man who has been in a senior federal appointment for the last 20 years and who believes with every justification that this is over and buried and gone." She asked for the name. Walter said it. She wrote it down. She looked at it. It was a name she recognized. a name that appeared in newspapers and policy discussions and official photographs with a regularity that spoke to a career of sustained institutional prominence. A name attached to a face she had seen in briefing rooms and committee hearings and the kind of professional portraits that hang in federal corridor walls. She understood now why the note under her door had said the next communication would not be a courtesy. She understood now what she was holding and what it would cost to hold it in public. She did not publish immediately. That was the decision that required the most nerve, because every investigative instinct she possessed was screaming at her to move fast, to get it out before anyone could stop it, to convert what she knew into public record before the people who wanted it buried could act again. But she had seen what happened to stories published before they were bulletproof, how they fractured under the pressure of official denial and institutional credibility, how a name attached to incomplete evidence became not an exposure, but a liability, how the person holding the story, rather than the story itself, became the subject of the counter-narrative. She spent 8 days building the documentation architecture. Graham, once she showed him the full picture in a 3-hour meeting that left him visibly shaken, assembled the legal team quietly and without announcement. They made arrangements with 2 other publications, one national, one international, to hold simultaneous release copies in the event that any attempt was made to suppress the review's publication. The documents were stored in 3 separate physical locations and 2 encrypted digital vaults, whose access codes existed only in Nora's memory and Graham's. On the 4th day, she received a phone call from a number she did not recognize. The voice was not the precise, older voice of the unknown caller. This voice was younger, female, and carried the particular flatness of someone reading from a prepared script while attempting to sound spontaneous. The caller identified herself as a communications representative for the federal official whose name Walter Price had given Nora. She said the official was aware that the review was pursuing a story and wished to offer a background conversation to ensure accuracy. She said the official had nothing to hide and simply wanted the opportunity to provide context. Nora said she would welcome a formal, on-record interview. The caller said the official preferred background at this stage. Nora said she understood and that she would be proceeding without it. The caller paused and then said that the official hoped Ms. Vance appreciated the sensitivity of the subject matter and the potential for unintended consequences when incomplete narratives entered public circulation. Nora thanked her and ended the call. She told Graham about it within the hour. They agreed it confirmed they were on the right ground. On the 6th day, she drove back to Morristown to see Felix Strand one final time. She wanted him to know what was coming before it came. He deserved that, she felt, after 35 years of sitting alone with a sealed envelope and a decision he had made on the side of conscience at a cost she suspected was larger than he ever showed. He was sitting on his porch when she arrived, which she had not seen him do before. He was wearing a jacket against the May morning chill, and he looked older than he had in March. Or perhaps she was seeing him differently now that she understood more fully what he had been carrying. He watched her come up the walk without expression and waited until she sat in the adjacent porch chair before he said anything. He said, "It's almost done, isn't it?" She said it was close. She told him, in general terms, what the story would say. The outline of Corridor 7 and Device 7 and Meridian. Thomas Greer and what he had found and what it had cost him. Calloway, whose real name she had by then established through a combination of Walter Price's partial recollections and a 1988 missing persons report filed in Nashville by a woman named Diane Calloway for her husband, Robert, age 38, a former federal contractor, last seen October 14, 1987. Robert Calloway had never been found. His missing persons file had been closed in 1990 with a notation that said simply, "Referred to federal jurisdiction. No further local action required." The name of the federal official who had authorized that referral and subsequent closure was the same name Walter Price had given her. Felix listened to all of it with the stillness of a man who is finally hearing a story he has known the shape of for a long time, without knowing its contents. When she finished, he looked out at the street. A school bus moved past at the far end, yellow and unhurried in the spring morning. He watched it go. He said, "Danny Reeves deserved better than what he got. He was just a good young man who loved flying." He paused. Marcus, too, whatever he got himself into. I don't think he understood what he was agreeing to. She asked Felix if he was prepared for what came after publication. The attention, the questions, the possibility of official pushback that might include challenges to his credibility. He was 71 with a heart condition, and she did not want him walking into something he was not ready for. He said, "I've been ready for 35 years. I just needed someone to open the door." The story, published on a Thursday morning in late May, coordinated across the Review and its two partner publications simultaneously. By noon, it had been shared broadly enough that suppression was no longer a practical option. By evening, 3 separate federal oversight offices had announced they were reviewing the claims. By the following morning, the official whose name appeared centrally in the reporting had issued a statement through legal counsel denying all allegations and characterizing the story as irresponsible speculation. By the afternoon of that same day, a former Meridian employee Nora had not previously contacted had called the Review directly and said he had documents. Walter Price called her that evening. He said he was glad. He said he had not expected to feel glad about anything connected to this in his lifetime. She could hear something in his voice that she recognized as relief, operating at a depth that had nothing to do with the current news cycle. The relief of a person who has held something heavy for so long that they have forgotten what it felt like not to hold it. She asked him if he thought the truth about Marcus Holt and Danny Reeves and Robert Calloway would ever fully surface. He said he thought it would take time. He said the people who built those structures were very good at creating distance between themselves and the operational reality, that there would be layers of deniability to work through and documents that no longer existed and memories that would prove conveniently imprecise. He said that was always how it worked, and that it did not mean the effort was wasted, that the effort was never wasted, that sometimes making something impossible to ignore was the whole victory, and everything else was slow work done over years by people with more patience than glory. She thought about Marcus Holt's last log entry, timed at 8:35 p.m. and written in ordinary handwriting on an ordinary form. A routine notation at the end of a routine flight. She thought about what he must have known when he wrote it, what he must have been feeling in the minutes before whatever came through that cockpit door. Whether he had understood by then the full weight of the thing he had agreed to carry. Whether he had thought about Elaine waiting by the phone at home. She thought about Danny Reeves in that photograph, half-turned, looking at something beyond the frame. She thought about what he had seen during that descent. The moment of comprehension arriving in the dark above the Tennessee hills, the lights of Harwick small and certain below, everything already in motion and none of it reversible. The families were notified before publication. Elaine Holt, 73 now and living with her daughter in Nashville, sat with the advance copy of the story for a long time before she said anything. What she said was, "He called that night. The phone rang once and then stopped. I always wondered if it was him." She did not cry when she said it. She had the composure of a woman who had cried everything out decades ago and arrived somewhere past it that was not peace exactly, but was the quieter country on the other side of grief. Ruth Reeves, when her daughter read her the story aloud in her room at the assisted living facility in Granger Hollow, closed her eyes and said Danny's name once. Then she said, "He warned me. He knew something was wrong." She opened her eyes. She looked at the window and the spring hills visible through it. She said, "He was always smarter than he let on." The federal investigation that followed the publication took 19 months and resulted in 3 indictments, 2 of which proceeded to trial. The official named in Nora's reporting resigned his position 14 days after publication and issued no further public statements. His legal team maintained throughout the process that their client had no operational knowledge of lamplight and that the documentation connecting him to the closure of Robert Calloway's missing persons case was ambiguous and circumstantial. The jury in the first trial deliberated for 9 days. Robert Calloway's remains were never found. The limestone ravine system in Caldwell County was searched twice, the second time using ground-penetrating technology unavailable in 1987. The searches found evidence of disturbed geology consistent with burial activity in 2 locations. Forensic recovery from those sites produced partial remains that were submitted for DNA analysis. The analysis was ongoing as of the time of this writing. Thomas Greer's death was officially reclassified from accidental to suspicious pending further investigation. His sister, who had never accepted the original finding and had spent 35 years quietly and unsuccessfully attempting to reopen the case, was informed of the reclassification by phone. She did not speak for a long moment when told. Then she said, "Tom would have hated that it took this long. He was an impatient man." Felix Strand gave a formal deposition to federal investigators in June 2022. He was treated, by his own account, with considerable courtesy, which he said surprised him. He said he had expected resistance. The investigator who took his deposition told him that his sealed envelope had been better evidence preservation than half of what the professional investigators had managed in 1987, which Felix accepted with a quiet satisfaction he had clearly been storing for decades. Walter Price did not give a formal deposition. His attorney cited the 1993 non-disclosure agreement as grounds for a privilege claim that tied the matter up in procedural review for the duration of the initial investigation. Walter called Nora twice during this period, brief calls in which he said little of substance but seemed, in her assessment, to simply want to confirm that things were still moving. She understood that. After years of stillness, motion itself was a kind of reassurance. The cockpit of the aircraft that had operated as Regional Air Flight 404 had been scrapped in 1993 as part of a routine fleet retirement. No physical evidence from the original scene existed beyond what had been archived and subsequently manipulated. The playing card that Arlen Pruitt had photographed and bagged and never seen again was never recovered, and its meaning, if it had meaning, remained speculative. Arlen retired from the Harwick County Sheriff's Department in September 2022. He did not give interviews. He sent Nora a brief handwritten note after the first indictment was announced that said, "I knew that bag was tampered with. 35 years is a long time to know something and not be able to say it." He signed it simply, Pruitt. Nora Vance continued working at the Review. The story received a National Journalism Award in the spring of 2023, which she accepted at a ceremony in Washington, with the particular discomfort of a person who was more interested in the next story than in the recognition of the last one. In her acceptance remarks, she said almost nothing about herself and spoke instead about Marcus Holt's flight log, about the quality of handwriting in that final entry, how ordinary it looked, how routine, how it gave no indication of what the man who wrote it was facing in those last minutes before the world he knew closed around him. She said that ordinary records made by ordinary people going about their work were often the most honest documents any investigation could find, because they were made without awareness of being observed by the future, and that the future, in her experience, had a way of eventually showing up to read them. She did not mention Danny Reeves by name in the speech, but she thought about him throughout it. The young man in the photograph, half-turned, looking at something no one else in the frame could see. She'd thought about that image so many times in the preceding year that it had become a kind of fixed point in her mind, a symbol for the thing that her work was always really about. Not the powerful people and their systems of concealment, but the ordinary ones who stood near the edge of something terrible and saw it coming and could not stop it, and left behind whatever trace they could of the fact that they had been there, and that they had been paying attention, and that they had known. The photograph of Marcus Holt and Danny Reeves beside the fuel truck in Nashville was donated by Elaine Holt to the Caldwell County Historical Archive in October 2022, on the 35th anniversary of the flight. It was mounted in a simple frame and placed in a small exhibit about regional aviation history. In the photograph, Marcus is smiling into the afternoon sun, his coffee cup held loose in his hand, his whole posture carrying the ease of a man at the ordinary midpoint of an ordinary working day. And Danny stands slightly behind him, half-turned, his face angled toward something beyond the frame. The archive's label beneath the photograph reads, Captain Marcus Holt and First Officer Danny Reeves, Nashville International Airport, October 14, 1987. Last known photograph. It does not say what happened to them. Most people who walk past it do not know. But occasionally someone stops and looks at it for longer than a casual glance would require, and stands there in the quiet of the archive room, reading the label again, and then looking back at the photograph, and then standing a little longer still, held there by the particular gravity of an image that contains something it cannot quite show. A story pressing outward against the boundary of what a photograph can hold, insisting in its stillness that the looking is not yet finished, that the looking may never be entirely finished, that some doors, once opened, do not fully close again.